Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Dan Schnur Political Report. Tonight, it's already 2024, handicapping next year's presidential campaign. I know you all know the drill with the Q&A. Please type your questions in at any time on the button at the bottom of the screen, and Rachel Kenderdine will walk us through all of your wonderful questions. Hey, Dan, welcome.
Thanks so much, Kim.
I know that we can't wait to dive into this wonderful discussion, so let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being with us for this discussion. As always, we're really grateful to have you. And as always, we're really excited to hear your thoughts, both in answer to our poll questions coming up in just a little bit, and of course, in the question and comment section that comes at the bottom of the hour when Rachel will join me. So it's not just me talking at you, but hopefully addressing some of the things that are of most interest to you. As you heard Kim mention, we're talking about the presidential campaign of 2024, even though it's still 2023. There's still about 9 months until the first primary takes place, a little bit less than that. But already all sorts of action and all sorts of activity going on in both parties. To me, what's most interesting is how strong the two likely frontrunners look at this point, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I'll talk to you more about that in just a minute. But before I do, just to get us started, I'm going to ask Katie if she can help me out by putting up the first couple of questions for all of you to consider. And first, we're going to ask you pretty straightforward. Do you think Joe Biden should run for re-election? Yes, he should. No, he shouldn't. Or are you not sure? And what I'll tell you, we'll ask you the same question about Donald Trump in just a moment. But right now, as I think most of you know, public opinion polls in this country show that large majorities of Americans do not think that Biden and Trump should run for re-election. We're coming at this a little bit differently. So we're, instead of asking it as a package, we're asking each one individually. So Katie, let's see. Oh, there they are, the results. 51% of our group thinks that Biden ought to run for president, a little bit more than half. 30% say no, 18% unsure. And so even that 51%, I will tell you, is significantly above the responses that we see in national polls, not just generally, but even among Democrats, because right now we're seeing that a slightly less than majority of Democrats nationally do think Biden should run again. Our group is a little bit more supportive of the president, but I have to tell you, 51% for an incumbent president, not a really strong number under normal circumstances. Of course, these are far from normal circumstances. And so with that, let's go to question number 2, if we can, Katie. Same question as I warned you on Trump. Do you think Donald Trump should run again for election for the 3rd consecutive time? Yes, he should run. No, he shouldn't. Or you're unsure. And I know there's not a lot of people who are unsure about Donald Trump, one way or the other on most things. But let's see how these numbers come out. 9% would like to see him run for re-election, slightly less than 1/10 of our group. 89% say no, 2% are unsure. So there are some of you who are still thinking this over, apparently. As we've learned in the past, our group does tend to lean somewhat leftward. So the Trump numbers aren't that surprising, that only a small number of our group think that the former President Trump ought to run again in 2024. Biden number is a little bit more interesting, but let's move forward. And what I'll offer you are 2 thoughts to get the conversation going that I'm hoping can be of some use to you as a jumping off point. I'm going to offer you just 2 thoughts about the presidential election. Number 1, Joe Biden, I believe that Joe Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump. And Biden and his advisors clearly believe that too. And we'll talk about the reasons for that in just a minute. So number 1, I believe very strongly that Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump. Number 2, I would argue just as strongly that Donald Trump is the only plausible Republican candidate who is likely to lose to Joe Biden. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes also, but let's start with that conundrum. Biden can beat Trump, but might be the only Democrat who can. And Trump would lose to Biden, but Trump might be the only Republican who would lose to him. And if you put those two statements together, it would suggest pretty strongly that Team Biden should be rooting really hard for Trump to maintain his very sizable lead in Republican primary polls, and that Trump should become his party's nominee for the third consecutive election cycle. Now, they're not allowed to say that out loud, but you can tell, if nothing else, by the way Biden uses the term MAGA Republicans in his speeches so frequently and with such relish, you can tell that he really wants a rematch. And that makes sense. Going back to what I said earlier about how I believe, and the president does as well, that he's the only national Democratic figure who can beat Trump. The reason for that is because he's the only national Democratic leader who's demonstrated a convincing ability to successfully communicate with the white working class voters who helped Trump carry the Rust Belt in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, and then who switched sides in large numbers 4 years later to support Biden. Now, if Biden were to decide not to run again for health-related reasons or any other reasons, it's very difficult to imagine Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg or Gavin Newsom achieving the same type of cultural connection with these voters that Biden has. And that would put the Democrats in a very difficult position should Biden not be on the ballot. Now, interestingly, there's an emerging generation of Democratic leaders who might be better at this than the candidates who I just mentioned. Midwestern governors like Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan and Josh Shapiro, who was just elected last November in Pennsylvania, they attract these voters the same way Biden does. And so if one or the other of them were running for president, they might be able to pull that off, but they are probably both one cycle away from running for national office if they choose to do so at some point in the future. Now, Biden's other unique advantage among leading Democrats is that his long career as a relatively centrist establishment figure makes it much more difficult for Republicans to caricature him as a dangerous liberal, and they tried in 2020 and without much effect. Biden went to great lengths, if you remember, in 2020, for example, to make it clear that he did not support the defund the police movement, and spent a lot of time in his speeches and in advertising, making that point clear, much more clear than a lot of down-ticket Democrats. And Biden has also distanced himself from his party's progressive base on energy policy, on budget policy, and as we found out just today, even more so on immigration policy, and more on that in a little bit too. So Biden might be to the left of many mainstream voters, but not many people see him as a radical, and that makes it harder to attack him from the right. So that's an advantage for Biden. But the flip side for the president is that the same non-threatening persona that keeps Biden from scaring swing voters also keeps him from doing much to inspire his party's base. Now, you all remember from the primaries of 2020, there were a lot of liberal Democrats, maybe some who are part of our group, whose hearts really belonged to Bernie Sanders or to Elizabeth Warren, but they fell in behind Biden during the 2020 primaries because they correctly saw him as their best chance of defeating Trump in November. Now, Biden isn't any more capable of exciting the Democratic base now than he was 3 years ago, but he and his team understand that that ability isn't as necessary when the threat of Trump can motivate loyal Democrats. So they might not be that, the Democrats might not be all that motivated by Biden, but they're still very motivated for Trump. And Biden, as most of you know, Biden has spent most of his career telling voters, he uses the line, "Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative." And this lesser of two evils approach works perfectly in his campaigns against Trump. But it also leaves Biden less well-positioned for a campaign against another Republican candidate, someone who the voters don't have such strong opinions about. Very, very ardent Democrats can get themselves very excited or motivated in a campaign against Ron DeSantis or Mike Pence. But a lot of more casual voters wouldn't find that general election matchup nearly as interesting or nearly as motivating. And the result, without Trump on the ticket, could be a lower Democratic turnout. Now, the other unique benefit that Biden has against Trump is that his age is much less likely to matter to voters in a matchup against someone who's only a few years younger than he is. So Biden's only a few years older than Trump, but in a contrast against a much younger candidate like DeSantis or Nikki Haley, would be much more noticeable and much less flattering. The generation gap would be very, very obvious, and it could work to the Republicans' advantage if it were something that the voters saw over the course of a very long and very taxing presidential campaign. But right now, that all looks pretty fanciful, because right now it looks like we are headed to Biden versus Trump round two. Now, as I mentioned earlier, polls show that 70% of Americans, more than 2/3 of Americans, say they want different choices than these two men. But there's not nearly as much clarity on who they'd like to have instead. So knowing that barely half of you wanted to see Biden run again, and almost none of you wanted to see Trump run again, we're going to ask you a couple more questions. And so, Katie, if I can ask you to go forward, let's see what these people would do if Trump weren't on the ballot. Here you go. Who should be the Republican nominee instead of Trump? And what I'll say to the Democrats we have in our group, don't vote for the person who'd be easiest for the Democrats to beat. Vote for the person who you think would be the most credible candidate for Republicans to nominate. And if you're an independent or a Republican, tell us who you might be willing to support if Trump weren't on the ballot. Is it Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor who has been running second in the polls to Trump for most of the last several months, but who's hit a bit of a troublesome stretch over the last several weeks? Mike Pence, the former vice president, who does seem to be putting together some base of support among religious conservative voters. Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the United Nations, who's announced her candidacy. And although it's unlikely that former Representative Liz Cheney is going to run, we included her as an option just to get a sense of our group. So of those four options, plus of course none of the above, who do you think would make the most sense for Republicans to nominate for president next year if Trump weren't running? Well, look at that. 54%, more than half of our group. Another good reminder that we do tend to lean a little bit left, maybe sometimes left center. 54%, more than half of our group, would like to see Liz Cheney as the nominee. Of those who are more likely candidates, Haley edges DeSantis 15 to 11%. But the truth is none of them do all that well. And except for Cheney, they all get beat by none of the above. So let's go on to one that's probably a little bit closer to the heart of most of our group members, if we can, Katie. Let's see their next question. Same question about Biden. Let's say Biden decided not to run. Who do you think the nominee should be? Should it be Vice President Harris? Should it be Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation? Should it be, for those of us here in California, our own governor, Gavin Newsom, who says he's not running, but seems to be getting ready to run at some point, whether it's next year or 2028? And then, of course, Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of the late Attorney General, who has announced his candidacy to oppose Biden in the primary, and will also give this group a none of the above option also. Okay, how did our group do on the Bidenless Democratic nominee? 39% none of the above. Buttigieg and Newsom really close, 24 to 23%. Kennedy down at 8%, and Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president of the United States, at 6%. But I have to tell you, Katie, what's most telling to me about both of these numbers is how both of these sets of results is how high the numbers were for none of the above, which shows a lack of enthusiasm and a lack of clarity, even among a very well-educated group like ours, for who the alternatives to Trump and Biden would be. So on one hand, most Americans don't want Biden and Trump to run again. On the other, we don't seem to have much of a sense of who should run instead. So what I'd like to do now, and we can talk more about the horse race later if you like, when we get to questions at the bottom of the hour. What I'd like to do now is turn to the issues, first to domestic policy. Now, the economy is almost always, the most important domestic policy issue in a presidential campaign. But right now, it doesn't look like either party has much of an advantage on economic issues. On one hand, we have low unemployment, historically low unemployment, and fairly solid job growth. But on the other hand, we're seeing high inflation and raising interest rates, which raise the prospect in turn of a possible recession. So it really is hard to predict a year and a half out whether the economy is going to work to the benefit of the president or the Republicans. But there's plenty of other issues on the landscape right now. And we're already watching how the two parties are both maneuvering to highlight the importance of other domestic policy issues besides the economy. Number one, it's become increasingly clear in recent weeks that the Democrats want to do everything they can to highlight the importance of the abortion issue. It's very clear that Republicans now have a major political problem with abortion, and I would say no real idea how to address that problem. The Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade last summer may have single-handedly prevented the expected red wave from washing over Capitol Hill in the midterm elections. And now we're seeing a brewing battle over abortion medication, which appears very, very likely to shape the 2024 campaign season. And while the Supreme Court last week chose not to hear the case over abortion medication, that issue is not going away. And we're already seeing major internal fights within the Republican Party about how to handle it. But both parties have their problems. If Republicans are pretty clueless on how to deal with abortion politics, I would tell you that Democrats, to me, seem to be just as baffled as to how they should be dealing with immigration policy. Now it appears, it was announced today, that Biden will be sending U.S. military troops to the U.S.-Mexico border later this month, so that when the Title 42 restrictions on cross-border migration expire in a week or two, that the U.S. is going to have a military presence at the border, which is not going to make the base of his own party happy. And Republicans, even before today's announcement, were already not particularly shy about finding ways to point Biden as being unduly soft on the immigration issue. So two real problems here, one for each party, which almost guarantees that the two parties are going to be trying to exploit their opponent's weaknesses. So get ready for Democrats to spend a lot of time talking about abortion, spend just as much time, or be just as ready for Republicans to spend just as much time talking about immigration. Now, in both cases, the parties' bases, or respective bases, are fundamentally at odds with the swing voters who decide presidential elections. Now, in neither case does the party, Republicans or Democrats, have any plausible idea of how they would bridge that gap between their base and swing voters. They face similar challenges on public safety issues, as Republicans have that same problem on gun policy, and Democrats have it on many law enforcement issues. But there's another issue I wanted to raise, another domestic policy issue that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, at least in the campaign context, that I'd really encourage you to keep an eye on over the next several months, because I think that this is going to emerge as a very unexpected but important domestic policy issue in the election next year. And that's the issue of electric vehicles. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration announced its new regulations for greenhouse gas emissions. And part of those regulations include requirements for 2/3 of all new vehicles sold in the United States by 2032, 9 years from now, requires 2/3 of new vehicles sold in the US within 9 years to be electric vehicles. Now, that's a major speed up of Biden's previous goal. He'd originally said that half of new vehicles sold by then would be electric. And by going up to 2/3, that's a big, big push. And that's almost certainly going to cause all sorts of debate in a country in which last year, only 5.8% of new cars were electric. And so going from 5.8% to 67% in 9 years is a big lift. And the politics of that challenge are going to get very, very difficult. Now, even before the political problems, let's talk about the logistical difficulties that come along with such a rapid shift. We need to dramatically upgrade the nation's electricity grid. We need to increase the number of charging stations. We need to secure large amounts of the very scarce minerals that are used for batteries. And a lot of those minerals, as many of you know, are mined in China. And there'll be judicial fights and all sorts of other obstacles to impact the availability of electric cars and trucks, and also their affordability. And the political challenge could get really, really difficult for the Biden administration. To be clear, the countries and the planet's move from fossil fuels is a critically important task. But climate change has never been an issue that's motivated large numbers of voters in the past. And so the challenge for Biden and for other Democratic candidates is going to be to frame an argument that will be just as emotionally impactful to their supporters to motivate them to turn out as it will motivate Republicans in opposition to these rules. And we've talked a lot in this webinar over the years about the growing urban and rural and cultural divide in this country. And I'd suggest to all of you that this debate over electric vehicles is going to even deepen those geographic and cultural divisions even further. The most obvious argument that's going to take place is going to be over cost. The federal government offers tax incentives that provide up to $7,500 for consumers who want to buy an electric vehicle. But at least right now, that $7,500 doesn't cover the cost of the difference between gas-powered and electric cars. And although over the course of the lifetime of an electric car, there's all sorts of long-term economic benefits, a lot of buyers aren't able to afford the additional upfront expense. And that creates an additional barrier for working class voters who've been leaning Republican. It also creates a real barrier for car owners who have to commute long distances, like those who live in rural areas. And so the kind of divides that we're already seeing between the two parties, I believe, are going to get much, much more difficult on this issue. Trump-era Republicans tend to live in rural and ex-urban areas. It's easy to see how red and blue America will line up in the fight over electric vehicle mandates. And it's just as easy to predict a Republican presidential nominee, whether it's Trump or someone else, leveraging this issue to motivate the Republican base. And again, as I said earlier, the question is, can Biden and Democratic candidates get their voters just as excited and just as motivated in favor of a fight against climate change in a way that they haven't been able to do in the past, to get their voters as motivated as Republicans may be able to do with theirs. So question for all of you, less on the campaign and more on the substance of the issue. Katie, if we can put up the next question. What do you think of Biden's plan? Do you support his proposal to require 2/3 of all cars sold in the US within 9 years to be electric vehicles? And as you see here, although the options are yes or no, we've broken them down into a few subcategories because we want to get a better idea of your thinking. So do you support Biden's plan to move toward electric vehicles? Option 1, yes. We should be able to make the transition without much disruption, no matter what Schnur says. Or alternatively, yes, we need to I support his plan. The change is going to be difficult, but we have to do it. Third, say, no, I don't support his plan. I worry about climate change, and I believe we do need to fight it, but this is too fast and too abrupt. Or finally, no, we shouldn't be doing this because it's going to cause real economic pain to low income, and I'll add rural drivers. So let's see how we did on this one, can we, Katie? Very interesting. Only 3% of our group said that the transition could be made without much disruption. But add them up, and more than half, 56% of us, believe that the change needs to be made. The overwhelming majority of those in the affirmative saying it's difficult, but we have to do it. And then 44%, which is actually a pretty sizable percentage for a group that tends to lean leftward, say no. 29%, almost a third, say, I believe that climate change is real, but this is too fast. And those are voters who Biden's going to have to win over. And 15%, I think for our group, a slightly surprising number, saying this shouldn't be done because of the economic pain it's going to cause to low-income drivers. Very, very interesting. So last thing we're going to do is we're going to move on briefly to a foreign policy issue that I also don't believe is going to get the attention that it deserves. And we'll talk about this foreign policy in the campaign in greater depth next month. Let's start with the premise that whether it's correct or not, we know that international relations tend to matter very little in most presidential elections. But we've got a war in Ukraine that's still raging. We've got all sorts of increasing challenges in China and on the Pacific Rim. Both Iran and North Korea are acting much more belligerent. So it seems logical that at least some of these issues might move to the forefront. But we don't see that in public opinion polls. For most Americans, Ukraine is really just background noise at this point, more than a year into the war. And while most American voters see China as a significant threat to the United States and to our allies, that danger still feels pretty abstract to most voters. But I'd argue that just like I think the electric vehicle article is a sleeper issue in next year's election, I think there's an issue in another international relations issue in next year's election that's going to play a very, very important role. And that has to do with our relationship with Mexico. And let me explain, because while most political discussion regarding the US and Mexico relationship focuses on immigration policy, as we talked about earlier, that's not going away. I would argue that the growing toll that the fentanyl epidemic is taking on communities across this country has the makings of a very explosive and potentially very ugly election year brawl. Now, for most politicians and their constituents, fentanyl is a topic for domestic policy discussion, talking about public safety and healthcare and other types of societal and cultural concerns. But Trump has already proposed deploying the American military to Mexico to directly take on the drug cartels there that process and traffic fentanyl. And a lot of other Republican leaders have offered less dramatic but similar suggestions. Now, shifting the border debate from immigration to narcotics carries massive implications for both parties. Now, think about it. When DeSantis got in trouble earlier this year talking about Ukraine, he offered a slight variation on the usual isolationist language that we're now hearing more and more frequently. He didn't just question the rationale for US involvement in Eastern Europe. DeSantis said, quote, I care more about securing our own border in the United States than I do about the Russia-Ukraine border, unquote. Now that's really important and it's really telling. And it could end up being a very effective messaging tool for Republicans next year, whether DeSantis is a candidate or not. Because while both Russia and China represent immense challenges to democracy, to global security, to a cooperative international order, not to mention to US economic and geopolitical interests, the border crisis is much closer. It's much more tangible. And it seems much more directly relevant to the lives of most American voters. And so framing the border problems in the context of opioids rather than immigrants presents another benefit for Republican candidates, at least potentially. Democrats have worked very hard in recent years and with some effectiveness to characterize the most restrictive Republican immigration proposals as racist and xenophobic. But securing the border to protect Americans from deadly narcotics, rather than as a way of preventing migrants from entering the country, doesn't allow for nearly as much of this type of argument and could offer some protection to conservatives who are criticizing current US immigration policy, It's one thing to say, I don't want those people here. And the pushback on that, on racism and xenophobia, like I said, has often been effective. But if the argument is made not against individuals, but against illegal narcotics, it becomes a much more difficult argument to counter. Now, let's be practical about this, because there are very real and very substantial obstacles to the implementation of the kind of cross-border military operation that Trump has talked about. It would destroy US-Mexico relations and essentially end any serious cooperation at all between the two countries on immigration policy. And Mexico's leaders have made that very clear. If the US and Mexico are no longer coordinating on immigration policy, then the resulting flood of arrivals across the southern border would also thoroughly disrupt most other US efforts at collaboration with countries in Central and South America to take on this challenge, and would dramatically worsen the current situation. Now, a confrontation of this nature with Mexico could also drive Mexico closer to China at a time when Beijing's influence in Latin America has become a very significant problem for US interests in that region. Now, of course, ironically, China is the starting point for the chemicals that are ultimately processed into fentanyl in Mexico. But China is a foreign policy discussion for another day, one that's less interesting to this country's voters, but one that we certainly need to continue to have in the future, and certainly will. So one last question from me before we open it up to your questions and comments. Katie, let's see what our group thinks about this fentanyl crisis. And once again, I'm going to ask you a policy rather than a political question, and ask, what is in your mind, what is the best way to deal with our nation's fentanyl crisis? Is it spending more resources on healthcare to treat fentanyl and opioid victims? Second, is it more resources for preventative measures, like counseling and other things that will keep people from turning to this drug to begin with? Third, is it more criminal justice and law enforcement measures, more police crackdown of the type that Governor Newsom here in California has just ordered in the city of San Francisco this past week? Is it a more forceful US non-military response to the Mexican cartels? Or, as many Republicans have suggested, should we consider a US military response to prevent the cartels from processing these narcotics through full-on military action? And Katie, how do we do on this one? Also interesting, 39%, more than a third of you, want to see more money spent on prevention and counseling. And no question, that's a very valuable resource. And if you add up the prevention and counseling, as well as that first option, healthcare resources, that together adds up to almost 1/2 of our group's response. 27%, a little bit more than a quarter, want to see more criminal justice and law enforcement resources of the type that we are seeing in some larger cities now. And much smaller percentages believe that directly confronting the Mexican cartels through cross-border action, either non-military or military, makes sense. So looks like our people are leaning toward health-related and prevention-related measures. But my guess on this is that as the election proceeds, we're going to hear a lot of debate on this issue, and it could even become the primary foreign policy debate point in this election, more than Russia or China. So with that, we're just a few minutes past the bottom of the hour, but I would like to ask Rachel if she's willing to join me, and then we'll see what kind of questions and comments all of you have to offer. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much, as always, for being here, and thank you to our audience. We have so many great questions tonight, but I want to start with two that I think are in the same vein. So the first is, do you think Team Biden ever gave any serious consideration to Biden not running? And given his strong record of achievement since becoming president, isn't Biden more likely to motivate his base and independents than in 2020?
Well, two really good questions. My guess, and it's just a guess, although it's based on a good amount of reading and research, is that the people around Joe Biden knew from the very beginning from January of 2021 that ultimately the Joe and Jill Biden would decide, the two of them, whether he would seek re-election or not. And if he decided not to, whether for age or health or other reasons, that would be the decision that the two of them made. And so I don't think that there's been a great deal of work on the part of Biden's advisors to sway that decision, not because they didn't feel strongly about it, but probably because they knew that they wouldn't have much impact on that decision. And so what they've done instead is they've prepared very, very thoroughly for a re-election campaign, but knowing that the decision on whether those plans would ever be implemented was something that would come down to the president and Dr. Biden. As far as his ability to motivate the base, what's become really fascinating in looking at public opinion polling is how little most Americans know about the Biden administration's accomplishments. Now, some of you might think these are good accomplishments, some of you might think they are bad, but because Biden has consciously taken a lower profile as president than his immediate predecessors, well, the consequence of that is voters are less aware of what he's been doing. Remember when Biden ran in 2020? He said, "You're not going to see me on your TV every night. It's going to be a much quieter White House." Well, it has been. And there's certainly upsides of that. But the downside is that voters aren't aware, even the Democratic base. And we're still seeing in public opinion polls that progressive Democrats, particularly Democrats from minority communities, and particularly young people, are not all that motivated about Biden. They don't like Trump at all. They would not seriously consider voting for a Republican, but are less than enthused about Biden. And this gets back to the point that I made earlier. Biden's campaign demonstrated in 2020, and for that matter in 2022, how effective they could be at motivating their base in dislike toward Trump. If Trump is the nominee again next year, they know how to do that. And while it certainly doesn't guarantee victory, it gives them a strategy on which to rely that's worked for them before. But as I said in the first part of the program, if Trump doesn't run and a Republican nominee who elicits less strong emotions were to emerge, that motivation for the Biden campaign might become more challenging.
Sticking with Biden for a minute, this audience member said, Tom Friedman, in his recent column in the New York Times, suggested that Biden and the Democrats, especially considering the probability that he may not be able to complete a second term, really need to consider whether Kamala Harris should remain his running mate. What are your views on this? And do you think that there is any possibility he might consider a change?
I think it's very, very unlikely. First of all, the Biden and his team recognize what a critically important role African-American voters, particularly African-American women, played in his victory in 2020. And if he were to remove the first African-American woman, the first woman of color, I should say, in the history of the vice presidency from the ticket, could cause a huge backlash. And going back to the point I was making a moment ago, I don't think the Biden campaign believes that they could survive the frustration and potential lack of motivation that they'd see among many minority voters if Harris were no longer on the ticket. There was some speculation last year, which people like me found intriguing, that Biden might decide to nominate Harris to the Supreme Court and make the case that she would be the first Black woman ever to serve on the US Supreme Court. Well, that's obviously no longer going to be the case now that Justice Jackson has taken her seat. But it's fun to speculate about for a little while. But Friedman's comment, even though it's almost impossible to see Biden removing Harris from the ticket, Friedman's suggestion comes from a place of legitimate concern for many Biden supporters, because they know Harris is not particularly popular. They don't feel that she's performed the way they might have hoped she would as vice president. And they're very concerned, given Biden's age, that the Republicans might be able to capitalize on voter concerns about Harris to convince people to vote against Biden. If you need any more proof, though, if you need any more convincing, not proof, if you need any more convincing that Biden is sticking with Harris, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the video that his campaign released last week, when Biden officially announced his candidacy for re-election, normally in a video like that, you see the vice president once, maybe twice, and usually in a photo with the president or the presidential nominee themselves. Kamala Harris appeared 11 times in that video, almost all in a shot of her own, not standing next to Biden. That tells me that the Biden campaign understands that they need to do whatever they can to boost Harris's reputation and her stature and her image so that she doesn't become that kind of drag on the ticket. They share Tom Friedman's concern, but their remedy is not to replace her, but hopefully to elevate her. We'll see if it works.
So shifting to the other side of the aisle, this audience member asks, if Trump loses one or more of his legal battles or is indicted by the DOJ, how might that impact his electability in the primary or in the actual electionary as the Republican candidate?
Well, what we saw earlier this year is that when Trump became the first former US president to be indicted, is that actually gave him a boost in the Republican primary. He realized considerable fundraising gains in the day after the indictment, and his advantage in the polls increased fairly considerably quickly too. What Trump argues to his supporters is that these type of legal actions are the liberal Biden administration unfairly trying to harm him and prevent him from mounting a campaign for re-election. And his argument is, rather than running against me again, they're trying to take me out with all these, no pun intended, trumped up charges. That does have a positive effect on him with his base, and ironically may strengthen him in his campaign for re-election. Now, we don't know if any of these legal challenges results in a conviction. We don't know if conservative voters might feel differently. But right now, if anything, it appears to be driving them more to his side rather than away from him, because they perceive this as something that the Democrats are doing in order to weaken Trump before next year's election. If Trump does become the nominee, and if he is convicted in one of these cases, it's just as clear that while that helps him among Republican loyalists, that it hurts him very, very badly among the swing voters he would need to win re-election. And it's very difficult to envision a voter who supported Biden in 2020, even if that voter supported Trump in 2016, coming back to Trump after a Trump conviction. And so if Trump does become the nominee, his path to re-election comes not from winning swing voters at all, but relying more heavily on turning out a conservative base than any candidate of either party has done in modern political history. That's why issues like immigration and like this electronic vehicles discussion I raised earlier are so important to him, because they can take a base that's already enthusiastic about him and motivate them even further.
So we have a few questions about other candidates who are in the race. Do you think Sherrod Brown could beat Trump? What about DeSantis or Haley?
Boy, Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, is one of the few national Democratic leaders who has Biden's affinity with the white working class voters who I was talking about earlier. And as I presume the questioner was asking, based on Brown's record in that regard. Brown has been a very effective politician, and he's been reelected several times in what's now a red state of Ohio. He thought about running for president, it's been reported, very, very seriously in 2020, and decided not to. I don't know at this point in his career if he'd be as formidable a candidate as he might have at one point. He's running for re-election next year and is facing a pretty difficult campaign inside the state. But the questioner is right in a very important regard. If Biden were to choose not to run, the Democrats would be smart to turn to someone like Sherrod Brown, even though he doesn't have the national political profile and may not have the natural political skills of some of the other people we talked about. So important are those swing voters. And the fact that we're talking about a relatively little known senator from Ohio as a potential replacement for Biden should Biden decide not to run, I think if anything, tells you how limited the Democratic bench is when it comes to political leaders with this particular skill set.
So we had a few questions about Amy Klobuchar. So I wanted to ask this one. Does Amy Klobuchar have a presidential or vice presidential future?
Well, I think she does. Klobuchar obviously was not successful in 2020 to a large degree because of the speed with which the party coalesced behind Biden. And the Democrats, as you all remember, fell in behind Biden much more quickly than normal because of their focus on defeating Trump. In a more conventional election year, it's entirely possible that Klobuchar or Buttigieg, just to name two, could have mounted a fairly credible primary campaign going forward. But both of them understood the danger of standing in the way of unifying the party behind its eventual nominee. We didn't include Klobuchar on that list of potential options because the computer system we use only gives us 5 options. I wanted to be fair to all of you and give you a none of the above option. I felt it was important to include Harris and Buttigieg. After that, Robert Kennedy is an announced candidate and is drawing close to 20% in some public opinion polls. And naming Gavin Newsom as opposed to Amy Klobuchar or Stacey Abrams or another prominent Democratic leader, well, write that off to my California bias. We see and hear a lot of them out here.
So one more question on the candidates. Do you think that the candidacy of Robert Kennedy Jr. will take votes away from Biden and create a Ralph Nader effect?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Nader ran for president in the year 2000, not in a Democratic primary against Al Gore, but in a general election. And Nader drew far more votes in the state of Florida than was ultimately the margin between Bush and Gore in that state. Bush only beat Gore in Florida, as all of you remember, by barely 500 votes. Nader drew several thousand votes in Florida that year. If you assume that even 3/4 of Ralph Nader voters would have cast a ballot for Al Gore instead of George Bush, and my own guess is it's probably more like 95%, then Nader did prevent Gore from winning Florida and arguably prevented him from achieving the presidency. Kennedy was not given any indication whatsoever that he would run in a general election as an independent, the way that, or as a Green Party candidate, the way that Nader did 23 years ago. Running in a Democratic primary, though, he certainly could weaken Biden. We've seen any number of incumbent presidents over the years: George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, Lyndon Johnson, all facing more difficult primary challenges than they anticipated. And all of them ended up either losing re-election or, in Johnson's case, withdrawing from the race. There's no indication at this point that Kennedy's going to play the same kind of role in this campaign that Ted Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy or Ronald Reagan or Pat Buchanan did in the previous campaigns that I mentioned a moment ago. But as I said earlier, there are a lot of progressive Democrats who are unmotivated by Biden. And it remains to be seen how credible a primary threat Kennedy could become, not to become the nominee, but maybe just enough to cause Biden one more challenge heading into a general election campaign against the Republicans.
So shifting gears to the issues, this audience member asked, will the Dobbs decision motivate Democrats and independents no matter who the Republican candidate is?
Oh, I think so. I have little doubt that the Dobbs decision, the court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, was the key to the Democratic successes last November. Republicans are very bitterly divided on this issue, on the question of a national ban versus the states making a decision, on whether that threshold should be 6 weeks or 15 weeks or some other margin. And so whenever a party is divided on an issue like this one, it almost always helps the opposition. But it's very clear that the way the polls shifted in the immediate aftermath of the Dobbs decision, we saw almost a 20-point increase and the number of voters who identified as pro-choice in this country in days after the court made its ruling last June. And what that tells me is there are a lot of Americans who philosophically aren't comfortable with the idea of abortion. And as long as it was protected by the US Supreme Court under Roe versus Wade, they felt comfortable expressing their discomfort by identifying themselves as pro-life. Once that protection was no longer there, and it became a much more practical consideration, a lot of those self-identified pro-life voters may have decided, I still don't like abortion, but I don't want to criminalize it either, which is why you saw such a shift. And I can't imagine a scenario in which the decision does not become a major motivator for Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee is next year versus Trump or whoever the Republicans ultimately nominate.
This audience member said, I like the idea of electric cars, but there's not enough infrastructure. Recently, there was a piece on 60 Minutes, and they were showing how they simply cannot charge with any reliability. Can the Biden administration ensure the infrastructure to have reliable charging stations and make electric cars more realistic for everyone?
So the Biden administration is investing billions and billions of dollars to try to improve the infrastructure for electronic vehicles. Not only the number of charging stations, but the reliability of them and the speed of them. And until that happens, I think the questioner is exactly right. It's going to be a very hard sell. We noticed that even with our group today, Rachel, more than a third of our respondents express real concerns about whether the shift that Biden is proposing is too fast or not. And so the only way the Biden administration is going to convince voters that this is doable is if they see very tangible results in terms of the kind of infrastructure improvement that the questioner was asking about. What's interesting to me is, in addition to the government investment, we're now beginning to see very large-scale private sector investment. Walmart, for example, is putting charging stations at many of its stores, knowing that logically, if you're charging your car, you need something to do. So maybe you'll go inside the store and shop. Subway stores are putting charging stations outside of their restaurants for the same reason. And so I wonder if at some point there won't be an effort not just to create a government-based infrastructure, but to provide a much broader range of incentives for the private sector to begin providing these services. Because the questioner is exactly right. Unless voters, i.e. drivers, feel comfortable that their car can be charged safely and reliably where and when they need it, that this becomes a much, much more difficult sell. And the challenge for Biden is there's no way to demonstrate that between now and next November. Any effort in this direction is going to take several years and hopefully be accomplished by 2032, regardless of your politics. But it's going to be much easier for the Republicans to argue the downside of what could happen if this isn't taken care of than it's going to be for the Biden campaign to argue the benefits of it.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I'll try to restrain myself.
Okay. Would Mexico really allow US soldiers in Mexico?
Mexico hates the idea. And in fact, for those of you who are students of history, you know that there have been two occasions in the past where the US military has gone into Mexico, a sovereign nation in its own right. And the people of Mexico and its government still remember both of those incidents with very, very strong and unhappy feelings. So as I said during the presentation, a US military presence in Mexico, and there is an argument, there are arguments to be made that we need to respond more forcefully to the cartels. But two things to keep in mind. One, the way the cartels operate is they're not large-scale, massive industrial operations. So it's going to be much harder. It would be much harder for the military to find them and to seek them out and to destroy them, because you're talking about very, very small groups and in very inobtrusive locations, as opposed to very large-scale complexes. But the bigger question is, if the US were to act militarily over Mexican objections, then any cooperation we have with the Mexican government on immigration or any other policy issue would freeze dead in its tracks. And as you know, on these programs, Rachel, I try not to argue one way or the other. So when I bring this up, I'm talking about the potential political ramifications of the issue. But there's no question that the policy considerations are very, very challenging.
So for our last question, we had a couple come in about this group, but this audience member asked, what impact, if any, do you think the No Labels group will have upon the 2024 election?
I don't think they'll have much of an impact. The No Labels group, which has done some credible work on Capitol Hill and getting Republicans and Democrats to work together, is now attempting to qualify a presidential line on the ballot in 50 states across the country for their nominee who would run against both Biden and Trump. And they've so far qualified in 4 smaller states. They're still trying to move forward in the rest. But I believe that No Labels' challenge is going to be similar to the one that we faced when we were asking questions earlier in this webinar about if not Trump and Biden, then whom. So there's been speculation about Joe Manchin. There's been speculation about Kyrsten Sinema. There's been speculation about a couple of moderate Republicans. But while nothing is impossible on this political landscape, I don't know who that third alternative would be for No Labels to put together as a plausible third option. I think the other challenge they would face is the Democrats are absolutely convinced that a third candidate from a group like No Labels would take more votes away from the Biden than from Trump, which would make it extremely difficult for any Democrat to take that ballot designation from No Labels, given the hostility they'd face from their own party. Now, Senator Manchin, from West Virginia, is facing a very difficult opponent in next year's race. The governor there, Republican Jim Justice, just announced a couple days ago that he's running. And so Manchin conceivably could decide, I don't have a future in elective politics anyway. I might as well give this a try. But it would take that sort of very unlikely circumstance for the No Labels effort, in my opinion, to have much of a difference in the election next year.
Well, thank you again, Dan, and to our audience. I know there were a lot of questions we didn't get to, but we will get to a few more in the continuing the conversation segment later this month. So looking forward to that. And I'll turn it back over to you and Kim to close us out.
Thanks so much, Rachel. As always, you and Katie have been great.